For over a decade, I shopped and worked at my local comic shop. One of the best parts about hanging out there was comparing notes on what I was reading with folks who shared my passion for comics. My comic shop is gone now, but we can still hold on to the magic of that in-store discussion. This is My Comic Shop Book Club. Welcome to My Comic Shop Book Club. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the 1994 DC Comics event 0 Hour is Mr. Nick Jones. Welcome, sir.
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm happy to have you on the show. And this is actually a special episode in a sense because this is the finale of this iteration of my book club podcast. So including this episode, we've done 12 episodes, 12 installments between January and June. I've loved them all in their own way. It's been fun jumping around, covering a bunch of different comic book stories. But I've decided to take the show in a new direction. So at the beginning of 2022, I'm going to be relaunching this show. So we're going to have a new title, artwork, music, slightly different focus and release schedule. So it's going to be a little bit different. But if you've been enjoying this, I think you're really going to like the new version. I'm very excited. And again, I truly have enjoyed this run of episodes. And I'm so grateful to all of my guests, including you, sir, and to all of the listeners who have been along for the ride for these 12 episodes of My Comic Shop Book Club. So the most important thing is for all of you listening or watching, make sure you keep your subscription active. So if you listen to the audio version and you're subscribed via your podcast platform of choice, keep that subscription active. And or if you are subscribed to my YouTube channel and you watch the video version, please stay subscribed there as well. And that way you won't miss the new version of the Book Club podcast when it drops in 2022. And of course, in the meantime, make sure that you keep tuning in to Digging for Kryptonite, which continues with bi-weekly installments. All right. The other reason why I'm excited to have you here, Nick, is that we mentioned you on an earlier episode of this podcast. I'm sure you recall.
Yep. Milksop.
You were not the milksop, though, thankfully.
I am not the milk. Well, am I, though? Am I? I did buy the Omni, so does that make me a milksop?
So the episode we're referring to, I felt so bad, man. So
no, it's fine.
So, for the most part, like out of these 12 episodes, most of the stuff that I covered, I had already read before, or at least read some of, and knew that it was good and knew that it was worth reading. But there were a couple of things that I was reading for the first time for this podcast, including the Red Hulk run by Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness. And you, bless your heart, you've been following along and you've been picking up trades or hardcovers of things that we're covering on the show that you didn't already own. And yeah, you bought that Red Hulk omnibus. And as we discussed in that episode, I had my buddy Jeff on, not the strongest material. And the first thing I thought of as I was making my way through that run, I was like, oh, I feel so bad that Nick bought that omnibus.
Now, to be fair, in my defense, I have Marvel Unlimited. I could have just read it on there. But I'm like, you know what? I like owning physical media because, I don't know, I'm dumb, I guess. Because I already pay for the year for Marvel Unlimited. So it's like, that's what, like $60, $80, however much that is. And the Omni was what, $100 for one story that's, as you were saying, is mostly subpar, but I mean, it had its highlights, but the low lights were way too low. You know what I mean? Like it didn't really offset it. And the way they jumped around between like, oh, okay, we're here, and then the Red Hulk is at this part in the story, and then the next issue in the Omni, like, but what happened between? How did we get from here to there? I don't know. It just wasn't very cohesive.
Yes, that is a very diplomatic way of putting it. But I'm glad that we could have you on here before we wrap this version of the podcast. Now, well, I guess we'll get into our feelings on 0 Hour, but part of me feels like you got me back with this one.
You think so?
So I went through, I was curious. I was like, okay, how did we end up here? And so I took a screenshot. You tweeted at me on February 16th. I took a screenshot. You said, at Desi Westside, it's me on Twitter. You said, I've got homework for you. And you had a couple of photos of the 0 Hour omnibus. And that got me thinking. I was like, that could be fun to do on the podcast. I hadn't reread it. I hadn't gone back to it in many years. Yeah.
It is 90s as hell.
Yeah, it's very 90s. But I'm curious, before we get into the story itself, what prompted you to buy the omnibus in the first place?
Much like the talking about like the death of Superman and stuff like that. Like that was kind of like the peak me being in the comic books thing and stuff. Like the '90s stuff with like all the zero issues. It's a heck of a gimmick. And then with Marvel having everything being like chrome covered, double wraparound, whatever different stuff they did. So it was like very gimmicky, and it was very much in my wheelhouse at the time. And then when I just like we were talking earlier, it's like I just finished reading the last issue of the 0 Hour miniseries today, and I was like, wow, yeah, yeah. So you just read the trade, right? So you just read the 5 issues.
Well, I did a mix. So I
Ish.
have what I own. I own the original trade that they put out in the '90s. I had that for many years, and I got rid of it in one of my purges. And then more recently, I picked up. I think this was 2018. What I'm holding up
Okay.
here, the 0 Hour hardcover. What's cool is that the hardcover includes those 2 like 10-page stories from Showcase
Showcase 94. Yep.
that kind of set it up. So that's in there, as well as a new introduction by Dan Jurgens, which is interesting. Gives some behind the scenes tidbits about what inspired the story and some of the behind the scenes of the making of 0 Hour. So that was kind of cool, but it doesn't include any of the tie-in issues. However, the DC app, which I am subscribed to, has pretty much everything. So last night, I did jump around a little bit, and I did read just a selection of the of some of the tie-in issues. Yeah, of some of the tie-in issues and a couple of the zero issues. So I did, because I knew. Now, well, let me ask you, how far did you get? Did you read? You didn't read everything, right, in the omnibus?
I didn't read. I read everything up to 0 Hour number 0. So I think there's 3 issues at the end. It's Green Lantern 0, Flash 0, and Damage 0. I think are the last 3 issues in there. Possibly. I didn't read those because I was like, yeah, I'm done. But Green Lantern 0 kind of, I think, takes place right after the end of 0 Hour number 0. So it's probably worth reading. I just didn't do it. But all the other stuff, yes, I did.
Okay. Yeah, so for anyone not familiar, and if you're any level of DC fan, look at that omnibus. For people who are watching the video edition, Nick is holding up that
and dust jacket, of course. But
yeah, well, yes, of course. So for anyone not familiar, right? 0 Hour was this 1994 event, primarily consisting of 5 issues, numbered in reverse. So it counted down from 4 to 0, released weekly. And much like other DC fifth week events of the 90s, like Final Night and Day of Judgment, Genesis, like all those stories, each DC title published in that month had a 0 Hour tie-in. And then the following month, each DC title had a 0 issue, which told or retold early moments from the beginnings of the hero's career to sort of lay out what the new status quo is following the changes from 0 Hour. And I mean, big picture, well, I guess we could talk about the genesis of this story, which Jurgens wrote about in his introduction. So it's crazy to think this was less than a decade after Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yep.
But sort of behind the scenes, the impetus for this was, a desire to iron out some of the continuity issues that had lingered following Crisis on Infinite Earths, and I guess new issues that had come up in that time. And what initially sparked this for Jurgens was he was drawing an issue of Mike Grell's Green Arrow, and he writes about this in the introduction, and Ollie was celebrating his 45th birthday. And that got Jurgens thinking, well, if Oliver Queen is 45, all of these other DC heroes who he's contemporaries with would also be about that age. So how does this timeline work? And then I guess elsewhere in editorial, they were thinking about that as well, along the lines of, again, these continuity issues that persisted following Crisis on Infinite Earths, which of course had consolidated the DC multiverse into a single universe with a single Earth and timeline. And so then that was that was sort of the jumping off point. And so in 0 Hour, we have time being destroyed from the end of time backwards. And I mean, that's the overall setup for it.
Yep. And it's like, so out the 2 issues from Showcase 94, those were like, you know what, those you should read just because it gives you who the what extent is that the guy's name character is and whatever, blah blah blah. So it's like, oh, all right, so you kick it off and it's just like, oh, okay. But like the reason I was throwing in quotes about the tie-ins or whatever is because it's like, oh, like this is an issue of whatever comic book, like Anima number 10 or 8 or whatever it was. And I'm like, I don't know any of these characters. And like the tie-in is like, oh, there's just like one panel that they show. It's like, oh, yep, here's a 0 hour thing. So it's like basically people are just kicking off new series. And it's like, oh, since we're doing this throughout all of DC, clearly all of the, like, it has to have a tie-in. So they just kind of like shoehorned them in. Like the Superman ones, the Flash ones, like any of like the major player ones, those ones are actually decent as far as the crossovers go. But like the random one-offs, it's like, I don't know who these characters are. It's like, oh, part 5 of 6 of a story. I'm like, oh, thanks, I guess. Like, I don't know why they're doing this big epic battle that's 6-part crossover and you're throwing it in the 5th issue. So I don't know. A lot of it, they could have just been like, yeah, you know what? Maybe these ones sit this one out.
I know. I think that's always the issue when they do these sorts of crossovers, when it's editorially mandated like that. Although, you know, it's. I was really thinking about this, and I want to get your take, because I mean, different ways of looking at crossovers, I guess. In some respects, I actually don't mind this 5th week version of crossovers that DC did in the 90s, where, again, we have the core weekly miniseries, and then it's like every book for that month has the banner on the title. And again, some are more relevant and more significant tie-ins than others, but it's not like a book is tied up for months crossing over with another title. Like other cross. So I mean, I don't know. Like, ultimately, what type of crossover do you find you prefer?
A blend, I guess, would be the way to describe it. So like what you're saying is not every book is like, oh, if you didn't read, Man of Steel number 30, you're not going to understand what's happening in Steel number 12. Like, not necessarily that, but if you're having the major crossover, there should be some sort of something like the early crossover issues where it's like, Superman meets up with Metron and that he does like his little message or whatever. Like, they talk about that in all of the crossovers that are in that part. So that was kind of cool. But other ones, like as far as the way they came out, it's like, we saw Alpha Centauri or whatever the guy named from the Superman line. It's like, oh, we saw him in 0 hour number 2. It's like, but I haven't read that yet. In the Omni, it takes place like that 0 hour number 2 came out after that issue hit the stands, where I'd be like, that's not helpful to anybody. But if like, it's more if they know from the beginning, okay, we're going to do X crossover at some point this year, not just like whatever. If you're starting a new series and you're like 8 issues in, you'll know that going in, like, oh, issue 7 is going to have to tie into this big thing somehow. So we'll figure out a way to make it work where it's not just the kind of the throwaway panel where it's like, oh, 0 hour, wink at the camera and fade to black, and that's the end of the issue. You know what I mean? Like that was my only thing with that. And as far as crossovers like that, if they could do it some way like that, which I know is asking a lot, that'd be kind of slick. But everyone has their own ideas as far as like you're saying, editorial decisions are always tough.
Yeah. And it's funny because like I said, I read some of the tie-in issues, we'll put that in quotes, on the app, and I would have to double check the order that they put them in. Because that is kind of interesting with the omnibus, that if it didn't quite follow the reading order that you would need it to.
Mm-hmm.
Although, as I've come to find, the DC Collected Editions department often leaves.
That's what I've heard.
Much to be desired. Well, you know what? It's a fun postscript, because I did an episode a little while, not too long ago, with Gabe from Omnibros Live, and we talked about collected edition trends, and he asked me, like, have I had a hard time sourcing certain stories for episodes that I'm doing, and I said, it hasn't really been a huge issue. Well, update on that. Because for the Superman show, Digging for Kryptonite, I am actually right after this episode airs, the next run of episodes on Digging for Kryptonite is a 3-part look at pre-crisis Superman. So I'm doing an episode on Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, right? So I'm looking for a selection of stories from each of those eras, and in print and on the app, it's limited.
Yeah, which is crazy.
More limited than you would think. There's, I guess, Golden is probably the best represented, because they've done those omnibus collections of Superman in the Golden Age. They've done a few of those. And that's the thing. It's like, as much as I would love to have this available digitally, where I can access it through the yearly subscription fee that I'm paying and be done with it, even if there were like a Superman in the Silver Age omnibus, it's like, I would consider buying it. At least it's available. And then I have a large selection of stories to pull from. Very challenging. So, just a side note. I mean, I will say, publication or listing order aside, the app does have all the 0 hour stuff. We'll give them that. Yeah, at least there's that. So I think I've gotten a sense from you already, but how did this hold up for you? Because I know you said this, I guess kind of held somewhat of a special place for you going in. I mean,
Yeah,
how did it hold up?
just because of like the nostalgia of, oh yeah, comics in the 90s, like it was a 5-week thing where every week you're like, oh, I got to get all the stuff and everything. Okay, I guess is the way I'll word it. Like it's not the best, obviously, because it is, a product of its time, the 90s, if you will. But the way it didn't really have a flow to it when I was reading it. So it like what happens in the actual main miniseries or whatever versus the filler stuff that was kind of put in there. A better way to read it would be the way you did it, which is get a trade of just a 0 hour, and then it's like, oh well, if they reference something and you like that character, sure, check out that issue or whatever. But I would not recommend anybody does it via the Omni because again, it takes you out. Like there's one 3-part story that bounces across 3 different Justice League titles. And it's like, I don't know who the character is, Triumph or whatever. I think he's in issue 0 of 0 hour. And he has a 3-part story that goes through the Justice League series. You're like, oh, okay. But it's not really like pertinent to the actual, like everybody like in the vanishing point and trying to deal with the actual mission, if you want to call it that. So if you can read the stuff that's tied to the 0 hour miniseries, I would say, sure, go ahead, but do it the way you did it, which would be read the miniseries and then go back and cherry pick issues that you want to read. That's the way I would recommend doing it.
I would recommend that for anyone who hasn't read it or is looking for a reread. I do recommend doing it the way I did. That being said, and if this makes you feel any better, I don't know that I was the best reading experience the way I did it either. Here's the thing. I have a lot of love and respect for Dan Jurgens and Jerry
100%,
Ordway,
yep.
the creative team. And of course they were, key parts of the Superman creative teams during the period that I read growing up. So
same here.
I have a lot of love, a lot of respect. To say this as diplomatically as possible, I don't know that this is the best representation of their work. I would say it is. I mean, it is very 90s. Here's my one 0 hour story from being a kid, and I was trying to remember. I don't think I read the main miniseries until a few years later, but I was reading the Superman books at the time, so I read the 0 hour tie-ins. I still remember this. I was at Dragon's Den, part of the now defunct family of stores, in Yonkers, New York. There was an outdoor shopping mall called Cross County, and there was a Dragon's Den comic shop there. And my mom had taken me, and I picked up one of the Superman issues that tied into 0 hour. I forget which one it was, but the other gimmick as part of the storyline was that as time was being erased, like the last couple of pages
would fade out. Yep.
Would fade out to white. Now, as a kid, 94, I was 7, and I wasn't reading the main miniseries. I didn't know what was going on. I remember that my mom bought me that comic, and I guess walking out of the store or in the car, I was flipping through it, and I was like, hey, what the hell? They're all blank pages at the end. And so we went back into the store, and she was like, excuse me, like there's a printing defect here. And then the guy, and I think, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, I don't think he was like, hey, dummies, like this is part of the story.
Yeah.
I think he explained it respectfully and nicely. But yeah, that's my one little 0 hour story. I remember that from being a kid. I was like, what the hell is going on here? So
that's
and then
funny.
Years later, as I read the actual story, then I fully understood. And
you're like, oh, I get it now. Mom, we weren't dumb. There was a thing.
yeah, it was like a whole thing. It was like a crossover. There's an omnibus now. But yeah, I don't know. Overall, there was some nostalgia there for me as I was reading it, and it was with any of these crossover events, and probably this one in particular. They really are a snapshot of the DC universe at a particular moment in time. And so there's something kind of cool about that as you see the looks and the different characters that were active at the time. Many of whom, especially the newer characters they introduced during this story, that I guess the hope was like, this is going to be the next wave of DC heroes. And a lot of them, didn't stick around. Not so much. But so there's that element that's like kind of cool. It's like, okay, you get a nice snapshot. But as far as the story itself, even putting aside the way the crossover was constructed.
Yep.
But even just the story itself, I found I wasn't terribly engaged as I was reading this?
Again, so you had mentioned Final Crisis before. It's like I never read Crisis. I haven't read Crisis. What? So Crisis on Infinite Earths, and the one they just that the most recent one is Final Crisis, I think, right?
Yeah, so it was Crisis, then Infinite Crisis was
Yes.
2005, and then then Final Crisis.
Yeah, I haven't read any of those three. So basically, any of my knowledge of DC stuff is after Crisis because it would have been like you were saying in the '90s or whatever. So it's like, yeah, everything we've done the last 10 years, let's just make that go away and we'll just redo everything all over again. And they even mentioned Crisis in it because Wave Rider sees I guess how he saw how Crisis happened or whatever. And everyone's like, yeah, are you sure though? Like, but I don't know. Like it's the 3 out of the 5. They talk about how Extent is the like the main baddie. And then like, oh no, it's actually Parallax. And it's like, okay. So Hal Jordan's behind all this? Does any and Guy Gardner's for the most part's like, why? Like, can we stop him? I don't know. It was weird. So some like reading some of the tie-in stuff, like the Batman stuff with Batgirl, like that issue is good because it shows her when she comes in and stuff like that. There's one of the issues that stands out to me is the Green Arrow, whatever. I think it's number 90, where it's basically just a silent issue. There's no dialogue at all, and it's mirroring panels, and it's like, oh, okay, if he jumped this way, he would have missed, and then like everything it's basically like a choose your own adventure book that you don't take your finger out of the page. It's like, no, I didn't do that. I didn't take my finger out of the page. It doesn't count. I thought that issue was pretty slick. I mean, it doesn't really do too much except at the end when he gets taken away by Wave Rider or whatever. But overall, it was just a pretty cool issue with it being like no dialogue and just showing a kind of chase story. It was pretty slick. But yeah, I don't know. The story overall, like you said, it's a lot of stuff. And then at the very end of it, you're like, but is it a lot of stuff? Was it? You know what I mean? It's like when you get one of those giant boxes from Amazon and inside is like one DVD. You're like, why is there a giant box and only one thing in this giant box? It's kind of the analogy that just popped into my head. It's a lot of stuff when there really wasn't a lot of stuff.
Oh man, that's like a perfect analogy. I'm with you. It was a sort of thing where as I was reading it, I mean, I'm not gonna. I made a promise to be honest on this show as I'm, talking about the stuff that I'm reading, and it was a bit of a slog. Even only 5 issues, it was a slog. And when I was done, I said to myself, I was like, I know Nick and I have a fun conversation, so I'm not worried. I know I'll get a good episode out of it. I was like, I don't know how much I really have to say about this story. Because it does fit the mold of the, I guess, quote unquote, like typical crossover, especially of the time where it's like all of reality is at stake. The heroes assemble, and it's a lot of them running around, like just trying to stop it and losing, and then they win in the end. But there's like a lot, and it's a lot of characters thrown in. And so, you might have a favorite character who has like a couple of lines or something like that. But I don't feel like anyone really, it's no one hero story, which is fair enough. Nope. I don't, that's not the nature of these events. But as a result, it's like, you just have like a lot of characters thrown together and like a lot of quick moments. And I think your analogy is pretty spot on overall.
Yeah, it's just a lot of stuff and not a lot of stuff at the same time.
I love that Green Arrow issue though. That was one of the ones that I read. That's the thing. There were some cool tie-ins. I read the Batman one as well, where Batgirl shows up, right? So that's the thing. As time is being destroyed, we're seeing all of these temporal distortions and anomalies. So versions of characters who no longer exist post-crisis, like Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, she shows up there and like, what's going on? So there's stuff like that. And so that Batman issue was cool. The Green Arrow one, really was. That was an interesting one.
I think that's the highlight of the whole thing for me.
I had, and I had read that at the time because I was, or not at the time, but later I had gone back and I was on a Green Arrow back issue quest at one point years ago, and I had read that, and that was a cool issue. I had forgotten about that. I did read, and I think these were probably the 2 strongest issues: the Green Lantern tie-in and the 0 Hour issue, and the zero issue.
Oh, the Green Lantern Zero. Yep.
Yeah, both of those were really strong. So the quote unquote tie-in issue there, again, not a ton of tie-in, but it was still a strong story. It was right after Kyle. Kyle has just become Green Lantern at this point. Yep. And his girlfriend Alex has been killed and stuffed in a refrigerator by Major Force, birthing the women in refrigerators movement.
Trope.
But So, but we pick up with the climax of his battle with Major Force. and him still dealing with the fallout of Alex's death and everything he's wrestling with. Is he going to continue as Green Lantern? All of that. And when he has his first meeting with Alan Scott, and Alan Scott gives him this whole tutorial on what the Green Lantern Corps used to be and who Hal Jordan was. Like, it was really cool and a momentous first meeting between these two characters. And then the Zero issue was even more interesting because it picks up right after the end of 0 Hour. And we find Kyle and Hal on Oa. And now you said you didn't read that one, right?
I didn't read. I read it back in the day. Like I still have the entire miniseries and all the Zero issues out in storage or whatever. But I haven't read it since it released, so I don't really like have any fresh thoughts on it or whatever. You know what I mean?
Gotcha.
But yes, I haven't read it recently.
That was worth a read. It was a nice postscript to 0 Hour, and also, I mean, it really cemented the fact that Kyle is our Green Lantern now, moving forward. At the time, because Hal like really kind of breaks down and explains like all I was ever trying to do is make things right. I lost Coast City. Like he kind of goes through everything, and Kyle feels a degree of sympathy. And Kyle, of course, is dealing with his own imposter syndrome right at this point in the story. He doesn't feel like he's worthy of the ring. He gives the ring back to Hal. Wow. And then very quickly realizes this guy is not all there and is able to get the jump on Hal and take the ring back. And he overloads Oa, basically. He like bombards the power within the planet with his ring and causes an overload. And in the aftermath of that explosion, we see Kyle as the remaining Green Lantern. And then Hal would come back in Green Lantern for a 2-part story, I think like a year or so later. And then Hal would, of course, continue to play a role in the DC universe and other events. But at least for the time, I mean, Kyle won, and Kyle was moving forward as the Green Lantern. That was a cool issue. So there was some really good stuff, I think, in and around 0 Hour, maybe more so than the main story itself.
Exactly, because again, the main story, like it's almost like it's like a one issue, like one shot would have, if they condensed everything down to like maybe like an 80-page one shot, it would have been way more impactful, if you will, as opposed to spread it out over 5 weeks or whatever. Who knows?
The other thing too that's funny, so you said you have not read Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Correct.
So I have, and I read it fairly recently for a different podcast episode a couple of years ago. So it's not super fresh, but it's relatively fresh for me. And that actually made me enjoy this less, to be honest, because, and we haven't addressed this yet, but we keep calling it 0 Hour. It's called 0 Hour Crisis in Time. Mm-hmm. Right. So it does have crisis in the subtitle there.
Of course it does.
It has to, right? But it's funny because I never think of it in that way, but it's true. It is crisis in time. And I think that was their starting point. And then they, added the 0 Hour to it. But I think the starting point was like, oh, we'll have another crisis. And having reread Crisis fairly recently, this kind of feels like Crisis Light because it hits most of the same beats, right? Instead of different Earths, different universes being wiped out, it's timelines in this case, right? And again, we have the same assembling of heroes, and instead of parallel Earths colliding with our Earth, we have alternate timelines and alternate realities colliding with ours. And, the Spectre gets involved towards the end, just as he did in Crisis. Like it hits a lot of the same beats, but it doesn't feel as momentous or as impactful as Crisis. And, Crisis, wherever you fall on it, it did streamline all of DC continuity into one universe, one Earth. And that was the fact that we refer to the DC universe as pre and post Crisis really says a lot. 0 Hour didn't have that. I think the intent
didn't do anything at all.
It really didn't do much because at the end of the story, right, they are able to restart time, and so the timeline, unfolds with some alterations. And I guess that was their way of, and actually Jurgens addresses this in his introduction where he says that they told all the creative teams that if there's anything you want to change or fix in that your 0 issue, this is going to be your opportunity to do it. So, again, I don't know how much really necessarily came out of it that was, that impactful even at the time, or that, had a lasting legacy.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think Aquaman, the only one that like jumps in my brain right now is Aquaman #0, because that's where he like lost his hand or whatever, and then he has the harpoon, the spear or harpoon or whatever for a hand for however long. Like, all these years later, that's the only thing that really kind of sticks out in my head is that.
The only other
But
thing for
other than
me,
that,
yeah, no, I'm with you. The only other thing for me, and this is actually not a small thing, and it's funny because we're talking about a very 90s crossover event here, but the the James Robinson Starman series was born out
yep.
of this. Have you read that?
No. Like I said, I probably read the Zero just because I got all of those because gimmicks. But no, I never really followed it after that.
So that's something that I do recommend. Like if you're looking, I mean, it's an 80 issue series with some specials and stuff like that, but it is so far afield in a great way of what you would expect from DC superhero comics in the 90s. It's James Robinson wrote the entire series, and it follows Jack Knight assuming the mantle in a very reluctant way, and very strong themes of fathers and sons in particular, which I think is something that you will relate to.
Yep.
You know, it resonated with me when I read it at the time. I've not done a reread since becoming a dad, and that's something that I know I will. Like I want to dive back into that because I think I'll appreciate it even more. But it was such a sophisticated and nuanced series. And again, that was born out of Zero Hour. So there was some cool stuff that did come out of it in unexpected ways. So at least there's that.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, again, and like you were saying, they were told, like, hey, if you want to fix anything with your series, Zero is the time to do it. So anything you want to add or subtract or whatever, now is the time to do it. So anybody that had never read comics can jump in theoretically at that point and just, go from there. But I don't feel like you said, like people still mention Crisis. Nobody really talks about 0 Hours. It didn't have the impact that they were hoping for, I'm guessing, because Crisis was what in the mid 80s, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. So, and it's what 30 years later we're talking about it. And 0 Hour was 10 years after that, and it's like, yeah, it was a blip. It was a blip in the thing, and now it's gone.
Yep, pretty much. Let's take a 30-second commercial break, and then we'll continue our chat. Much more to say about 0 Hour. Movie lovers should check out this family of film festivals: the Brightside Tavern Film Festival in Jersey City, the Hang On to Your Shorts Film Festival in Asbury Park, and the Point Lookout Film Festival on Long Island. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the podcasts hosted by the festival's organizer, CJ Cullen. You can find the official Hang On to Your Shorts podcast, as well as the Cullen on Film podcast, via a shared universe network. And we're back. So, you mentioned a few of the tie-in issues that you did enjoy. What else, either tie-in issues or moments in the main story, stood out to you? Either way, whether you really liked it or didn't. What really jumped out at you?
Let me get my notes. I have 3 pages of notes. Because all I really did was put the issue number down and say whether or not it should be read or not. Let's see. No.
Oh, wait. While you're going through your notes, let me just share this with our audience because I don't want anyone to think, it's funny because we didn't address this at the top, and I don't want anyone to think like, what the hell? Like Anthony made Nick read this entire omnibus. He only read.
No. You told me repeatedly, hey, you can just read the 5 issues and that'd be cool. I'm like, no, I'm gonna do the whole thing. And I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have done that.
Which I want, that, and that's the thing. I respect your process, and so I was like, look, if you want to read all of it, go for it. And it's helpful to me because it's like now you can share stuff about issues I didn't read. But yeah, just to be clear, all that was required was the main 5-issue miniseries, and you went for that omnibus.
Of course. So I mean, there's one of the Superboy tie-ins, Superboy number 8. It's your very 90s Superboy. That was a fun read just because the classic Superboy or whatever, it also it starts with him and then the 90s Superboy shows up and whatever, and then it shows like the Welcome to Smallville with the home of Superboy with the classic Superboy pose or whatever, and then at the end of the issue it says visit Hawaii or whatever, and it shows because I guess that's where 90s Superboy is from. It's the same, basically the same billboard but with the new Superboy on it. That was a pretty entertaining read because, Superboy's like, oh, I got to go visit all of these people that I know. And it's like, yeah, nobody knows, like, it's been years or whatever. So I think he goes to visit Lana maybe. and she's now married to someone else. She's like, "Oh, you were my only love," and blah blah blah, and flies away. And that one was fun. There's one Team Titans number 34, I think is the one that's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, 21. I don't have a good reason why it should be read because it's like not really like a great story. I think it's just a fun story to read, regardless of where it falls in the thing. It was just fun. I don't know. After I finished it, I'm like, yes, you should read it. Why? I don't have an answer for that. It's enjoyable. You know what I mean? There are a lot more no's and maybes than definite hard yeses. Like anything that's like I was saying, the main people involved, like Superman or Batman. I guess the Flash issue, sort of, because that kind of leads right up to the 0 hour number 4. Yeah, the first issue, because that's when he like gets to. It shows how he gets to wherever he is in the future or whatever. So some of the, like main DC heroes, sure, read those tie-ins, but other miscellaneous ones, you don't really have to. And again, some of them, like I said, some of them are fun. Like there's a Steel tie-in, but it's just like Steel. It's a very heavy continuity in the Steel story, like world or whatever. So you're like, I don't remember these characters because it's issue 8 or whatever. So it's like, he's with his family and stuff like that, and then a young John Henry gets taken out of time from wherever he is, and he ends up in the present. And he saves like his family and stuff. And they're like, oh yeah, oh our uncle's name is John Henry. He's like, oh, we have the same name. It's just like one of those type of, I don't want to say cheesy, but so it's like it's not really important to the 0 hour world, like overall thing. It's just like it's like a maybe read it if you really like Steel. Sure, read it. But yeah, that Teen Titans 21 is just a fun read for zero reason, I guess. And again, obviously that Green Arrow issue is, I think, the highlight of all of the non-main heroes, I guess, because the Green Lantern issue, like you were saying, is a very important one as far as the story goes. You know what I mean? Like, so Superman, Flash, Batman, Green Lantern, those for sure, just because they all tie in pretty heavily with the whole story. But anything that's kind of random, unless it's something you care about, like I never really got into like the Legion of Superheroes or Legionnaires or whatever they are, and like the stories of those, I'm like, I think it's part 4, 5, and 6 of a 6-part series. It's like a 6-part crossover thing, and I'm like, okay, what happened in the first 3 like thing? I don't know who these characters are or what their, I guess, motivations are. It's like, oh, these past versions of ourselves. I'm like, they don't even look like the same people, so I can't see how you're saying that the past versions or the future versions or whatever, like, they're not the same at all, like not even remotely similar. So it's really hard to kind of follow a lot of the stuff. If you like the Superman, Batman stuff, I was actually following those titles at the time. There is one Shadow of the Bat issue that I don't recommend reading. It's like at a out of time Alfred, and it's like a completely different guy. Like he's a klutz and he's like really bad at being a thing, and he thinks he's going to be a detective. And it's like this story, like the Shadow of the Bat line was just very strange anyway, because it was just a weird story, like line of books anyway. Shadow of the Bat and like Legends of the Dark Knight were always just a very strange Batman thing because they were kind of out of continuity anyway. But yeah, like there's not a whole lot worth definitely reading. You know what I mean? Like the 3 JLA titles, Catwoman, like, yeah. Which one did I say? Hard no. What is that? Oh, yeah. It'd be better if I could read my own writing. Yeah, Anima number 7. I was like, I don't know who this character is. Like, I think she's one of the characters, like you were saying, that was kind of created right before the event, and they're like, oh, we'll kind of get people to read this book by having that 0 hour tag on it, is a good way to like drag people from the main story into like your other books you got going. But when you're like, yeah, no, this makes sense because it's like it's not really a tie-in. It's like the last 3 panels just fade to white, and it's like, it doesn't tie into the main story. So if you got it picking it up, you're like, oh, there's going to be something to do with 0 hour, and you read it and you're like, but it doesn't. And I don't know anything about. You just end up more confused than anything else.
Well, and that kind of harkens back to the original Crisis where, there was the whole Red Skies bit, right? So I think books sort of had, and I didn't, as much as I read the main Crisis series, I didn't read the tie-in stuff. But my understanding is that, much as in the case here, there were some titles that did tie in a more significant way, and others that just kind of had the red skies, a la the white issues at the end, the white pages at the end of 0 hour, that sort of thing, just to sort of let you know like something's happening. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's par for the course with this. I did read the Superboy issue, so I'm going to be revisiting that issue on Digging for Kryptonite in the future, because next year on that podcast, I am planning a look at the pre-crisis Superboy,
Okay.
a character I've been very mixed on, because I don't really love the
Mhm.
idea of Clark operating as Superboy, but I've kind of come around on it a little bit, because it's like so many of the elements that I loved from the Smallville television series and from, comics that I've read post-crisis. It's like, well, they did borrow from a lot of that. And so it added to the mythology in a way that is meaningful to me. So I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on that. So I'm going to spend some time with pre-crisis Superboy. So I did take a look at that issue, and yeah, that was cool to see the two of them interacting. The Green Arrow issue was also a highlight, as we said. It reminded me of when Marvel did their Nuff Said event.
Enough said. Yep.
All those all silent issues. And yeah, I would be curious to hear what the motivation was to tell the story in that way for Green Arrow. But it was really like, that was a cool issue. That was really a lot of fun.
The
And
weird
yeah,
thing
the
about
Green
it
Arrow, yeah,
is that it was the conclusion of the Crossroads
yeah.
story. So I don't know how many parts it was. I know I had issue 86 because Catwoman was in it, and I had all of that line of Catwoman. I had all of her appearances and everything. So I know it cross-referenced something with that. So I think he was just going around, and it was like him teaming up with different heroes per issue. I think, I can't remember. So it's like it's a conclusion of however many part event, and you're like, but how is this the end of your your big Green Arrow event? I don't know how they kind of felt that would tie it up, I guess. I mean, he kind of walks away from everything at the end of Zero Hour, but it's like, I don't know if you're reading like a 6-part story within your run, and it's like, okay, so it ends on a silent issue. What was resolved? Especially considering of the way it did it. Like it's a really slick issue, and I like it as a standalone thing. You know what I mean? But if you're having that be your end all be all of whatever run you were doing, it to me it just kind of seems lost, if that makes sense.
So I can speak to that a little bit, because I am familiar. It's been years, but I am familiar with that Crossroads storyline. So that was right after Mike Grell ended his lengthy run on the book.
Okay.
And during the Grell era, the book kind of existed in its own little pocket of the DC universe. Not necessarily out of continuity, but it was really sort of its own thing. And so I guess the idea with Crossroads after he left was that he was going to have like this tour through the DC universe and team up with all these characters. So as best as I recall, I think it was more of a thematic banner, the Crossroads thing, rather than like a 10 or 15 part
A story.
storyline.
Okay. All right. Gotcha.
Now, to your point, I still don't know how much this necessarily like wraps that up. But then right after this, as far as just kind of placing this in the context of the Green Arrow story, right after this, Oliver is going to go to the monastery where he's going to meet Connor Hawke, who he'll find out is his son. And then that ultimately leads to Oliver's death in Green Arrow 101, just about a year after the issue that we read for this. So that's kind of where that falls. Yeah. So again, interesting stuff sort of around 0 Hour. I sent you one of the funniest aspects of all of this to me was DC made this 15-minute promotional video that they sent to comic shops to get them to order 0 Hour and those 0 issues that followed the 0 Hour crossover. And this 15-minute promotional video, it's on YouTube. So if you just search for DC 0 Hour promotional video, you'll find it. And it features interviews with most of the DC editorial staff of the day as they are describing the crossover and the 0 issues and why they're such great jumping on points. And the coup de grace of this whole thing, the kicker, is that they have this shadowy green figure who's watching all of the interviews on television monitors. And of course, we know, having read 0 Hour, that's Parallax. And so he's kind of watching and roasting the interviewees as they're talking about it. It's an interesting and fun 90s relic, and you get to see the DC offices and the DC editorial staff. What did you think about it?
Like you said, it's very, I don't want to say silly, but yeah, I have an idea for you. All of your comic shop friends that you dealt with your my movie of last year, my comic shop country documentary, you should send them that video and ask them if that would make them order this storyline, because I would like to hear Sean's take on that. That would amuse me to no end. Lord Retail, I wonder if he'd give you straight answers to how many copies he'd order.
No.
Yeah, no, of course not, never. But yeah, it was I don't see, like, honestly, that was sent to like comic shops to be like, hey, you should order this, and this is why. That's kind of crazy.
That's my understanding. I don't know if it was
That is
used
bonkers.
in any other thing. And it's funny because, that makes sense, right? Because there was no YouTube at the time.
Of
How else
course.
would they have gotten this? No internet the way it is. So yeah, unless they showed this at conventions too. I don't know, but I think that was the primary purpose. And listening to the interviews, it does make sense. Like, you could see why, like, that would track if that was the main objective. I have to ask Steve Odo of Alternate Realities. I'm sure he won't remember,
Of course not.
but I'll ask him. But yeah, on that note, that was how you and I crossed paths. Was you started tweeting about my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, which is on the wall behind me here, and you were so complimentary and so gracious. You had me on one of the podcasts that you were a part of. You named it your movie of the year. I was very honored, and I'm glad that we've been able to connect and now become friends via social media and do this. So yeah, the movie really brought us together.
Yes, it did. And I now would say that I have a relationship with Menachem from Escape Pod and Sean from Fat Moose. I talk to Mark at Yeah Comics now and then, but
Nice.
yeah, it's definitely opened up a lot more stuff. Menachem definitely appreciates it because I definitely get orders from him quite a bit. But yeah,
No,
it's
that's
good
very
stuff.
cool. Yeah. But so that 15-minute video, yeah, it's so funny. And there's one line that really jumped out at me. The late Denny O'Neil, Batman group editor at the time, said that those Zero issues were the best jumping on point for Batman since 1939. That was
Yeah,
a
I heard that.
bold
That's a
statement.
bold statement. Yes, it is. Yeah, to be fair, to say any issue is like this is the best jumping on point ever is a bold statement. Just in general, you know what I mean? Like, because to be fair, like, wouldn't jumping on after Crisis be kind of the best point to jump in on anything? Because that's kind of where they rebooted everything, right?
Well, so, all right. Well, with respect to Batman, yeah, you have Batman Year One, which is to this day regarded as one of the best Batman stories of all time. So yes, I would argue that's probably your best jumping on point. But that's the thing with Crisis. I was going to bring this up, so I'm glad you mentioned it, because I felt this way after rereading the original Crisis, and even more so now. I truly feel it was a misstep to not do a full-on hard reboot after Crisis on Infinite Earths, because what they did was not a full-on reboot. They retold the origins of characters and they wiped the slate in certain respects, but it wasn't like they just completely started from scratch. That's why we ended up with Crisis in Time and then Infinite. Like, they keep having these events over the years to clean up the continuity. And I think had they just done a straight reboot, which, as I recall, I think this was in Marv Wolfman's like introduction or afterward to Crisis. I think that was his intention.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was pushback on that. So it ended up not being like as full of a restart as intended. And so, like, Crisis itself sort of became like this vague memory that the heroes had of a battle they fought. Like, I think it ended up being something a little more nebulous than originally intended. And I think that led to the need for stories like this. And I think you look at a story like Zero Hour, and there are some effective moments and character beats, and I have a couple of examples. But I think all in all, whenever your starting point for a story, look, at the end of the day, all these stories are designed to sell, to make money, and that's par for the course with this. But
Of course.
that being said, in the construction of a story, I think when the motivation behind it is continuity cleanup, it's exceedingly unlikely that you're going to get like a wonderful, dramatic, like emotionally resonant story that's going to stand the test of time. I just don't think those types of stories are built for that.
Of course, yeah. Because the only way to do that would be to be like, okay, the end of whatever crossover thing is like the last panel, whatever hero it is dead, and then you just start the next one. It's like, okay, all those people are dead. Here's like, that was universe A. This is universe B, and this is how it is. That, like, any of those stories don't matter at all. Like, nothing you know about that is whatever. It's here you go. That's the only way to do it. And even that, you're still going to get the people that are like, well, this is very similar to what happened. It's like, yeah, it can be similar because, forks in the road and whatever, blah, blah, blah. People may still end up at the same point through their lives, but there's no real easy way to do a hard reboot like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the story is what it is. There's some good stuff in there. I did not read the Superman tie-in issues because I plan to hit those on Digging for Kryptonite
Yep.
probably next year, because the Zero issues introduced Kenny Braverman, who would go on to become the villain Conduit, who discovers Clark's identity and basically takes apart his life. It was a pretty cool story in 95, I want to say. Yeah, I think it was 95. But they introduced him in those Zero issues. So I will be hitting that on the other show.
Of course.
I do
Of
look
course.
forward to that. I mean, all in all, I think the Zero issues were probably the most effective part of this, right? Even if it wasn't
Yeah.
a matter of like fixing continuity, but just in terms of, giving people a jumping on point. Like, this is an issue, we're going to lay out their backstory and their motivation, and maybe make some alterations, but introduce new characters, like in the case of Conduit. So like I think there was value, at least in the Zero issues, and then DC would do the same thing during the New 52. They did a whole month of Zero issues.
Yeah. See, I never I am when I was into comics, it was more like, Superman, Batman, X-Men type of stuff. And now it's more, I definitely lean more towards Marvel and like Image type of stuff over DC. I don't really get a lot of the DC collected stuff just because, don't get me wrong, Marvel continuity is a nightmare and nobody should try to untangle that web. But I basically like the Marvel Epic collections, like you and Gabe had mentioned those. Like there are 17 lines that I am getting. I don't want to say all of, because I don't care about Silver Age stuff. So like X-Men, I'm starting at volume 5, which is where Claremont took over. So I'll take 5 through them. Daredevil, I have whatever. I had all of them. I don't care. Again, don't care about early stuff. So once Frank Miller starts it, that would be my first book in the Daredevil run. But it's like they keep rebooting and everything with like DC, because they had whatever, and then they had Rebirth, New 52. Now is Rebirth, right? Like, I don't know. Like, they keep like, oh no, we're starting all over. No, we're starting all over. No, we're starting all over. So it's like I just can't even find a like jumping on point for DC. You know what I mean?
I mean, look, my heart is with DC, but it's like, I know it's challenging. And, with the New 52, that was as close to a hard reboot as they've done. But even there, and I know I've talked about this in other podcasts, but there too, it's like books that were selling well, like Batman and Green Lantern, they, for the most part, kept those storylines and continuities intact. And then right off the bat, it created problems, because it was like,
Of course.
in this version, the heroes have only been active for 5 years, yet you have Damian Wayne, who's 10. And it's like, well, how does that work? And then they came up with this whole, they did sort of retcon that, and it was like, oh, artificial aging. Like, they had to throw all this stuff at it, and it quickly got problematic. So yeah, the fact that, we kind of keep going through this, it's a little frustrating. I definitely identify with that.
Yeah. So I mean, it's tough, but if you like a character, you'll find a way to enjoy it. You know what I mean? Like, so like I like Batman, Superman, stuff like that. So like the Batman Ninja Turtle crossovers, I'll get those just because I also like the Ninja Turtles. So those are just fun reads, and the movie's great. But like overall, I don't have a whole lot of DC. Like, I have the JLA. You did the Grant Morrison JLA, right?
No, not yet. That's coming next year.
That's okay. So I have all of that run from issue 1 through like the final whatever issue. Like, I have all those trades. I'm definitely more of a trade than a single issue guy anyway, just because space and all that stuff. But for the most part, I don't really have a whole lot of DC stuff. So like, but I, like you're saying, Starman. Like, I like Vertigo. I have a lot of the Vertigo complete stuff, like Fables and 100 Bullets is great, stuff like that. But you were saying, like I said, Starman. I heard, I vaguely remember the Ray being kind of like with the Zero thing, kind of I don't want to say relaunched him, but kind of made him more relevant, I guess is the way to word it, because he was in um the Zero miniseries, but like he didn't have a tie-in issue. There was no tie-in issue of the Ray. So, but I know like there's a Ray number 0. Like they like, oh, these new characters, we'll start them at issue 0. So great point to jump on when we'll introduce all these new characters or whatever. I don't know. It's interesting, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, again, like there were, a lot of those characters and titles. I mean, that was the thing going through, even just scrolling through the app, because they do have Zero Hour collected on the app, like in its own little hub there where they have
Nice.
everything, which is convenient. But just seeing some of the titles, like the Outsiders title and Valor, and some of these other ones that it's like, I
Hmm.
don't even remember that
I
these
don't know
were
who these people are.
these were titles. And yeah, characters who did not stick around. They introduced a new version of Doctor Fate.
Yep.
Again, like a
It's
very
just fate,
'90s,
right? I
just
think.
Fate.
Yeah.
Well, if you remember from the promotional video, the tagline was "The doctor is out," and it's
Right.
just
Yes.
Fate.
Yes. Yes. And he doesn't have the mask now. He's just got the Ankh tattooed on his like half of his face, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think. Yeah. Yeah. 90s as hell.
Very, very '90s, and well, kind of on that note, when we talk about things that did stand out about the Zero Hour, the main storyline, I guess three things really jumped out at me. One, this was actually kind of minor, but I liked it. I thought this was a really nice touch and very in character. Once the heroes realize what's going on, that time is being destroyed and changing, and they're trying to set everything right. Guy Gardner um, thinks to himself, like, maybe we can save Hal, like we can save Coast
Yep.
City, like we can put things right. Which I thought was a nice touch and speaks to that relationship there, strained though it might have been at times. But I thought that was
Hmm.
cool that he had that thought of like, oh, like I can help my friend. So I thought that was cool. And then the JSA. I mean, the JSA gets taken apart in this thing,
Yeah,
fighting
they do.
Extant at Vanishing Point. And I guess that was again going back to this idea of like how old are these characters actually? I think the JSA posed a problem for the DC creative and editorial teams because they were so tied to World War II, and of course they've been around for so long. So it's like how old would they have to be? And then of course like they came up with all these various like spells and potions and like all these artificial means of having kept them
Yep.
young, and Extant undoes all of that, and some of them die, and others are aged. It stands out, not necessarily in a great way, because I think that really it took them off the board for a while. But then, a few years later, we would get the magnificent David Goyer, James Robinson, Jeff Johns relaunch of that whole series and mythology, which is to this day, I mean, my favorite, JSA incarnation.
Hmm.
Have you read any of that?
I, of course not.
It's
Nope.
good.
But again, lists of things are things I like. So I'll like I pursue, I guess the way to word it. Like for me, there's a huge difference between like buying comics and reading comics. You know what I mean? Like I have all of these complete runs of stuff. It's like I'll read it someday. I'll be able to get to that someday. So it's like if I hear that, oh, like this is great, you should check it out. It's like, all right, well, I'll add it to the list. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah,
do a lot of adding things to lists and then maybe I'll read it someday. We'll see.
I hear you. No, I totally respect that. And then the last thing I wanted to ask you, again, I know you're not, like, I know your heart is more with Marvel and all of that, but what any take on Hal Jordan's role as Parallax and all of this? Because we find Hal here at a very weird point in his
Very weird.
DC journey. So I don't know. What did you think of the use of Hal in this story?
Like I didn't read what was it, Emerald Twilight, I think is what it was called.
Yeah,
Like when Coast City was destroyed. Like I was never really huge into Green Lantern. Obviously, I know who Hal Jordan is and everything. So, like, I understand like his quasi motivation of him basically losing his mind, being like, "I screwed up and I can fix it. Like I can fix this. This can be fixed. I have the power to fix it. Just let me fix it." And what you're talking about with Guy Gardner when he was like, "Oh, maybe we can save Hal and stuff like that." Like that was a cool moment when they had basically the divide of like the Batgirl out of time. She's like, "Well, I just want to live. So if I don't side with him, I'm gonna die." So like the final issue there, they have a couple of the heroes like, "Oh no, we're gonna side with Hal and extent or whatever, extent whatever." Um, but Guy is like, "Yeah, no, I can't be on the same side as that guy." That
right.
guy's a jerk. It's like, no, I like Hal. Sure, Hal has some points, but this guy, no. So having them kind of be divided, it gave it a little bit more. I don't want to say weight to it, but it made it more. And even saying realism is a bit much, but it gave it more whatever the word is that I can't think of. It gave it more something because it's like, okay, well, like Batgirl, if she sides with the rest of the heroes trying to stop him, she's just gonna die. So, but then when she sees that he's gonna take out damage, he's like, well, you can't just kill the innocent kid. So she sacrifices herself, whatever. And that's another thing that throws Green Arrow. He's like, yeah, I can't. Like it can't do this anymore or whatever. He's like, you're not going to be like, you may not have existed, but you won't be forgotten, I think is what he says, something about that, like along those lines. So yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. The train left the station. I forgot what I was saying.
Well, that's no, that's the thing. And then that's a larger conversation about Hal Jordan and the journey that they took him on in the 90s. My dear friend Rich, who, a member of the Alternate Realities crew, I mean, he loves Hal Jordan, and he was not a fan of Hal's villainous turn. And I know there were a lot of fans who weren't. I guess it's interesting for me because I did not have that affection for Hal. I mean, I met Hal during Reign of the Supermen, or I guess I met him during Funeral for a Friend, but really got to know him during Reign of the Supermen when Coast City is destroyed by Mongol and the cyborg Superman. And I mean, it really wasn't until years later that I then went back and I read the stories that followed Reign of the Supermen in the Green Lantern title, where Hal goes mad and destroys the Guardians and the Corps and becomes Parallax and all of that. And, since then now, of course, I've read, because he had this run where he basically was popping up in DC's like big events for a few years, right? So he emerges as the surprise villain in Zero Hour. He emerges as the surprise hero in Final Night.
I didn't read Final Night.
And then, so I would recommend that. That's been really the next, as much as Hal did make a couple more appearances in the Green Lantern title. I think it was called Parallax View. I want to say there was like a 2-part story where he fights Kyle again in the pages of Green Lantern. But then Final Night is his somewhat redemption. And then Day of Judgment is when he becomes the Spectre.
Yeah, I was going to say, because he was Green Lantern, then he was Parallax, and then ultimately became the Spectre, which Kevin Smith brought back in Quiver or whatever it was, the Green the Green Arrow thing. Yep.
Exactly. So, do I think that these large events were necessarily the best way to tell Hal's story? No, probably not. I think that probably did the character and the fans a disservice by having these major turning points in the character happen in the middle of these events instead of his own story where it really could be fleshed out. But I don't know. For me, again, as someone without an attachment to Hal, I think the broad strokes of it are pretty interesting, at least. I mean, it makes, that's the thing. It's like, it makes sense why he would go down the path he did with his 100%. City destroyed.
I can fix it.
These Guardians he loyally served who have the power to fix it won't let him. I mean, I know, and I know the counterpoint is like, well, Hal would still never do that. And it's like, fair enough. But again, I don't know. It was interesting. And again, he kept popping up in these, in these events. So yeah, it's funny because at the time I don't know, and I guess I don't know how surprised people were when he emerged as the villain in this story. Like I just don't know if this was something that people were like, oh yeah, it's probably going to be Hal, or if they really were like, oh my God, I can't believe it's him. I don't know. But yeah, listeners, viewers, feel free to write in.
Yeah, especially if you were like big in the DC universe at the time. Like I kind of was, but I can't really remember being all that. Like you said, like I don't really have an attachment for Hal Jordan either. So it's like if you'd been like, because you were what was this, 94? So
yeah,
I was like 14, so I wasn't like super steeped into everything. But if you really knew all about the DC universe and like, was it like that big aha moment when it reveals and you're like, oh my God, that's Hal Jordan or whatever? Or were you just like, I guess that's Hal Jordan? Because that's the way I felt. It's like, I guess, yep. Hal lost his mind. And I mean, again, it's that I have the power to fix this. Let me fix it. That's like his mentality, and I get it. But I don't have the attachment from like the back in the day Hal Jordan when he was like the big hero and stuff. So
yeah. And I have to say, especially reading that the Green Lantern 0 Hour tie-in and the 0 issue, it reminded me of like how cool Kyle is. Because he was really the Green Lantern I grew up reading, especially in the pages of Grant Morrison's JLA, in particular. And as much as, I enjoyed the Green Lantern Rebirth storyline where Hal came back, and I enjoyed his redemption, and I thought that the explanation of how he was possessed and manipulated worked well enough, without sort of just completely retconning, wiping away, pretending that it had been an imposter or something like that. Like it worked within the bounds of what had been established well, so I enjoyed that story, but I was not as hot on the Green Lantern series that followed that Jeff Johns did. And I know that was super, it was so popular. The Sinestro Corps War, Blackest Night, like all that stuff was really popular.
I have all that stuff to read. I just haven't read it yet.
I'd be curious to know what you think when you do. But again, I didn't hate it, but I just wasn't as into it as everyone else. And again, rereading these couple of issues just made me appreciate Kyle more. And to be honest, for the future version of this book club podcast, I don't know that I would really devote episodes to like that Jeff Johns, Hal Jordan run, but I probably would go back and I'd reread the Ron Mars and the Judd Winnick, Kyle Rayner stories, because I have fond memories of them. And even just reading these couple of issues, I'm like, man, like that held up well. Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a good way to do it too, is like you're saying, taking someone that was a big Hal Jordan fan and having you reread the Kyle stuff, and they may not have read that. And then you can be like, okay, explain why like Hal is the end all be all. Like, he's like the end all be all of all the Green Lanterns. Whenever you talk about Green Lantern or whatever, people are like, oh, it was Hal Jordan. It's like, yeah, but it was Kyle. John Stewart. See, I never read anything with John Stewart, so I know zero about him. So it's like, everybody's like, no, it's Hal Jordan. It's Hal Jordan. So they keep trying to make him a thing, I guess is the way to word it. You know what I mean? Like you said, he keeps popping up in all the crossovers and all that stuff. So, but I don't know.
Yeah. And it's like, look, I know there are a lot of Hal fans. I don't dislike Hal. I like Hal well enough, but there's really something about Kyle, this idea of, first of all, the fact that he's an artist and, he wields a weapon that can create anything he thinks of. So I think that lends itself really well to, to the Green Lantern power itself. And I guess here's where I understand why people would feel differently. Like I sort of like the idea that he was randomly given this ring and he wasn't prepared for it and he had to learn to become a hero. I think that's kind of cool. That being said, I do understand that does run counter to the Green Lantern mythology. The whole thing is that people with the rings are chosen. So it's like, but again, without having grown up reading that iteration of Green Lantern, I didn't have that attachment to it. So this idea that this kid who's like really kind of a mess is going to find this ring and become the person he's supposed to be, like that resonates with me. But I do understand why people, don't like that. And, I would imagine Green Lantern fans who are, I guess, on the more traditional side have probably been thrilled in recent years. I mean, with the full restoration of the Green Lantern core and mythology. I mean, that's, John's brought that back in a huge way.
Yeah, I've heard again, not being huge in DC, I've heard mixed things about Jeff Johns. Like, there are people that are like, he's the best ever. And then there are other people like, no, like he's the worst. You know what I mean? Like, it seems to be a very divisive topic, I guess. But I mean, as long as the majority of people feel like it's good, if you want to word it that way, you know what I mean? It's good overall, I suppose. But I mean, you're not going to please everyone all the time anyway. So.
Very true. I mean, there's a stretch of Johns that I really did enjoy, like early to mid 2000s when he was doing Flash and JSA, Hawkman, Teen Titans. That I think was his strongest work as far as I'm concerned. Stuff that's followed after I've been more mixed on. I guess the next work of his that I'll really be taking a look at is his Superman on the Superman podcast. And that
what's that podcast? I've never heard of that.
Anyway, how many times have I plugged it in this? I just want to make sure everyone's,
I don't know. Everyone's aware of it.
Everyone's aware, but his take on Superman is not necessarily my preferred version. So I'll save that for that other show. But yeah, we will be talking about that.
I'll be looking forward to that.
And then one other thing on Zero Hour. So at the very end of Zero Hour, I guess one other thing that I did think was powerful was the fact, as you mentioned before, that it was Ollie who puts the arrow in Hal's chest at the end. I mean, these two
And Kyle's like, no, you don't have to do anything. Like, he's got no power left. Like, and Ollie's like, yeah, no, I can't. Nothing. He has to be stopped. And like you said, it's Ollie that makes that call, if you will. And they'd been so tight for all those years and everything, which is why, again, it ties into when you were talking about the Kevin Smith run, when like it's Hal that has to convince Ollie to go back or whatever. So,
yeah. The only thing, and again, not to be a downer here, but I guess the only thing that then gets a little tricky for me is that, yeah, that's a powerful moment where Ollie shoots Hal with the arrow. Mm-hmm. And, certainly if you have a knowledge of DC history and their relationship together, that that's really impactful and that packs a punch. But it's like solely in the context of this story. I mean, Ollie only shows up like at the end.
Yep.
Hal only appears towards the end. So I guess that's a problem that I have with a lot of these big events and crossover stories where, you have things like that and you don't really have a point of view character whose journey you're following through this.
Yep.
So, again, and so that's one of those things where reading that as a kid for the first time, I don't think that really, it's like I knew it was a big deal from that final page where Ollie walks away. He's like, but I didn't have the history, so it didn't really mean as much to me. I guess in an ideal scenario, we would have had enough within the story itself to really build up to that moment as opposed to
some flashbacks or whatever of them doing, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, pal things or whatever. Even if it wasn't like a huge thing, but some sort of, even if you have just like when he's drawing back the bow, you just have like that be the big splash. And then you have all around like just different memories that he's having of times he had with Hal, but it's not even that. It's just, he shoots the arrow and you're like, okay. And then they have like the ghostly image of like, classic Green Lantern and Green Arrow, like side by side type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But again, and I recognize for the most part, that's just not the nature of these events. And I get
of course
that. It was, I don't know if you're like a big fan of like Wave Rider and the Linear Men and all that stuff. Now, having watched DC's Legends of Tomorrow, I was a little bit more intrigued by, like Rip Hunter is there. And, of course, in this show, Wave Rider is a person as opposed to a ship on the DC show. But it was kind of cool now, having watched that show for so many years, to kind of go back and see those characters get the play that they did at the time in the comics.
Yeah, I haven't watched Legends of Tomorrow, so I don't really have much basis of knowledge of that entire group. I know I've seen Wave Rider appear in other things across like my reading of DC, but nothing super specific, you know what I mean, that I can like jump to. But yeah, I mean, it's, if anybody gets anything out of this, then hey, it's succeeded. But
yeah, and then I guess the last couple things I have are in Jurgens' introduction to that relatively new hardcover. He does talk about the new time trapper who appears on the final panel of 0 Hour, and he strongly hints that was the Barbara Gordon Batgirl. So
interesting.
As far as I know, and I'm pretty sure nothing else was ever done with that version of the character with that, but that seemed to be the intention. And then there was a CBR article that Jurgens gave a quote for it, confirming this, that his original intention was for the JSA to get their own Earth after this storyline, for Hal, I guess, to create an Earth 2 for them. And then obviously that wasn't the case, but just, it's weird to me, I guess, that, and I would love to talk to Jurgens about this, because that seems to run so counter to what the direction was.
The point was,
we had Crisis to consolidate everything, and then we had this storyline to smooth out the timeline. So the idea that like, oh, now we're going to create another Earth, like I said, seems to run so counter to the mission statement. I don't know, but that was his intention.
Yeah, that is, like you said, it's kind of very counterintuitive to the whole plan. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to smooth everything out, but we're going to have this one group, they'll have their own reality or whatever. It's like, but we just wanted to put everything together. I mean, okay, do your thing, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, that's all I got. Anything else that you wanted to say or talk about with respect to 0 Hour?
As far as 0 Hour goes, no. But as far as my Desiato RC goes, I still don't have my Superman logo for you yet, and I'm waiting. I reached out to and they supposedly have stickers too, so I will be getting that. But during the commercial break, I ran and grabbed the body. So it's got the where's the stupid camera?
I can see. Way. There we go. Yeah, I see the Fat Moose Comics sticker.
Fat Moose Comics there. Amalgam is in the back window.
Nice.
Hopefully, will go there, and I'm gonna put a Superman decal right there between the bars.
Very nice.
That's the plan. We shall see.
That's cool. Well, if it's cool with you when it's all done, I'm happy to post pictures in the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group, so everyone can see, and on my other social media pages. But Listen, man, thank you so much for doing this. This was fun. I'm glad that we got to podcast again and that I got to have you on one of my shows. And yeah, I'm sure we'll be podcasting again in the future. I was saying this to you off mic, but I'll share with our audience as well. I was so excited to see the microphone that you have because you sound great. You say, I mean,
Well, good.
I've been happy with the audio quality I've been getting with all these remote recordings, but again, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? In terms of what my guests are working with on their end. So the fact that you have like a true microphone, for me as the podcaster, I'm like, oh, like this is so nice. So thank you.
Yeah. When the podcast I had you on, Film Guff, they were in the UK. Well, they are in the UK. So I've always podcasted remote. I've only podcasted in person a couple of times, and that's when I took a West Coast tour a couple of years ago and visited some friends out there that have podcasts, and we actually sat down in one room together. So this is the way I've always done it. So it's like, yeah, you have to have a decent mic and all that setup. So yeah. Kevin Alley over at Film Guff, that's where I am no longer a part of, but hey, they're still doing their thing. So check them out.
Right on. All right. Well, listen, Nick, thank you again very much for being part of this. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers for checking out this and any of our prior installments of My Comic Shop Book Club. Again, we'll be relaunching in 2022.
Looking forward to it.
So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited. There will be announcements before then, but make sure that you come back next year for fresh book club installments from Flat Squirrel Productions. And until then, remember, they're all imaginary stories. My Comic Shop Book Club is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Kristen San Gregorio, music by Basic Printer. If you like what you heard, be sure to check out my other podcasts, Digging for Kryptonite and My Comic Shop History. Sign up for exclusive content, including the official book club companion podcast, at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, and watch my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, out now on Apple TV and Amazon.